Welcome everyone to our NCAA Social Series, episode 18. I'm Andy Katz. Pleased to be joined by Dr. Brian Hainline, the NCAA's Chief Medical Officer, and Juliette Kayyem, a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, a former Assistant Secretary in the Department of Homeland Security, and a current CNN analyst. Dr. Hainline, I want to start with you. We do this every week. Catch us up as to where we are, because last week we showed that curve of where we thought we would be versus where we are. So a week later, where are we in terms of getting back on the field?
Well, Andy, I'm not sure the curve has really changed meaningfully in a week, but you know, we did put out guidance to the membership. What would it take to actually, you know, have competition? And it involved testing recommendations. It was really a very holistic document because, you know, we all know we just can't test our way out of this pandemic. We all have to behave a certain way as individuals, as members of society. And so that document was well received. And then we've subsequently put out a frequently asked questions document because the membership came back to us with many questions. We have a checklist. So that's all in the planning stages as if, you know, the fall season will proceed. But in terms of where we are as a society, you know, I think the one thing that has shifted perhaps is that there's a bit more openness to universal masking. We still have a ways to go, but I think that is starting to shift, and that's a meaningful perceptual change.
So Juliette, before we dive into the logistics of everything, I just want to get your sort of 30,000 foot view of this, because in New England, in New York, that was the bad area. Now it's the better area, and now we're at the heart of college football in the South, the Southwest. They're getting slammed. How do you explain what happened to where a couple of months ago they were thinking, okay, we're going to be fine by the summer. We can have football and everything else. And now it's a 180.
Right. I mean, the simple explanation, and I should be clear, I am not a doctor, so I do, but I'm a consumer of health intelligence, and then I help institutions plan for what they're seeing is, you know, we just opened up too soon or didn't close enough. I mean, in other words, we sort of did everything sort of half-ish. No overall national strategy. So we got the worst of both worlds, right? We got a bad pandemic compared to every other comparable country. And we've got the economic, social, institutional impact that we're seeing with sports. But just, you know, and I want to say you're picking up on what Brian said, that it's really interesting what's happening sort of one city, state, institution, college, university, corporation at a time. My job is to advise these people and monitor what's going on nationally, especially in the absence of national policy, because that then you can drive things, you know, one individual institution or city or state at a time. So right now, over 70% of the American public is under what we call level 2 or level 3 masking orders. They are actually required to do it anywhere, both indoor and outside, depending. So that's not nothing. That's a huge swath of the American public is under that. 48 of the 50 most populous cities are now under masking orders. We see institutions like colleges and universities and sporting facilities, and we see big corporations like Walmart. So while there's a debate about masking, that debate is like, it's already been settled, right? I mean, in other words, you're going to see 80% by next week. So it's just good, helpful for people to know that, because you can get focused on, I'm entering this big controversy, and actually most of the American public in the polling wants a national masking policy, and most of the American public is living under one. So
Brian, let's go to the practical side on these university campuses. Voluntary workouts. Football started it. Now we're seeing other sports, men's and women's basketball. And at least through social media, we are seeing everyone listen to the guidelines. We're seeing coaches with masks, gloves, using the electronic whistle. The players don't have it when they're actually working out, but everyone around them is using it. So that message that Juliette is talking about, how much are you seeing it and hearing back that it has gotten through to at least attempt this? They're actually listening.
Well, you know, it varies, Andy, because I think when the athletes are actually in athletics, so let's say those 4 hours a day, there's really a pretty good deal of control, and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, because, you know, it's really important if athletics is to succeed, if sport is to succeed. But, you know, there's 20 hours in a day that are unaccounted for, and we're hearing all sorts of different stories. And this is from the boots on the ground team physicians and athletic trainers. And you know, I'm not saying it's hard or easy, but you know, when we're talking about young adults, people whose frontal lobes are completely myelinated, and their decision making is sometimes driven by factors that aren't necessarily rational, and that's just a fact of life. You know, they may go out and put themselves in a situation where it puts them at risk of really contracting COVID-19. And there's still a mentality out there, and this is a very real mentality, that, you know, what's the big deal if I get COVID-19? And the herd mentality, the herd immunity mentality is still out there. Even though, you know, we've said this before, I still haven't met any scientist or epidemiologist who thinks that that's a good idea. So there's still a lot of education that needs to go on. And I think that as the coaches take a more leadership position and say, look, this isn't just about athletics. This is about a way of being 24/7. You're going to see this shift. But we haven't seen it crystallize yet.
Juliette, to that point, what about those other 20 hours, the controlled environment, the 4 that the coaches and athletic trainers and doctors have them versus the rest of the day?
Right. It's why a bubble is all you got right now. I mean, in other words, the bubble that the NBA did, it worked. You can't do that for college students. They've got other things going on. They have to be other places. And so what you're trying to do from the planning perspective is for these students, and I think it's important to talk about the role of coaches in their lives, is you're trying to do 3 things simultaneously. You know, everything is a debate in this country. You know, it's like, you know, masking, no masking, you know, open, close. Like, it's actually slightly more complicated than that. And so what you're trying to do, and from the planning perspective, what you're seeing the colleges and universities try to do is you're trying to minimize contact intensity, right? So sports are really hard because most of them exist for contact intensity. There's some that don't, golfing, tennis, the ones that we often talk about. Hard to talk about football without contact intensity. And so what you want to do, you know, whether you're a Target or a Walmart or a sport program, is limit contact intensity. Second, manage the number of people who are together. So this you can have some control over, especially if you have testing for a limited pool like the athletes. You just keep spectators away because it's just a numbers game at this stage. 5 is less than 50, which is less than 500. You just, you know, your chances of getting it are high if you're with 500 people. And then the third is you want to maximize individual mitigation, and this is where the coaches come in. You know, be a smart player, mask all the time, you know, don't be around too many people, don't party, test when you're required to test, and follow the science. And so that's where the individual mitigation behavior matters a lot. And, you know, I see the same thing in 20 somethings. They think it won't hit them. If it does hit them, they won't get sick. And they're not thinking about, you know, one, who they're going to get sick, but also the one variable we don't know is the long-term impact of this. So I'm a 50-year-old woman. I'm healthy. I'll probably, if I got it, I'd probably fight it unless there's something I don't know about my system. It'd be hard. But what does that mean for me when I'm 60 or 70? And if you're a healthy 20-year-old athlete, maybe you fight it relatively easy, whatever. What does it mean when you're a 26-year-old, you know, out of college, but still want to play a sport that you've devoted your life to? We just don't know. And so part of it is telling them, you may be fine today, but we don't know what it's like 10 years from now.
So Brian, let's go to testing strategies because there are a number of them. Where do you land on what could end up being the most successful and maybe, at least in the short term, the one that will, you know, help at least manage this problem to get through these first couple of months of a potential season?
Well, where we've landed is a place where I hope we're not going to stay. And so where we landed is the gold standard, which is still the polymerase chain reaction, the PCR test. You know, it's taken by way of either a nasal pharyngeal or nasal or salivary test. So, even the professional sports are doing it using different ways. So Major League Baseball uses salivary testing, the NBA uses the nasal testing. And so, the very few people in sports are doing the full nasal pharyngeal swab. But that has to go out to an outside lab. There's a reagent, and there's still delays in this country. There's delays sometimes just waiting in line to get the test, and sometimes the test can take way more than 3 days, 5 to 7 days. And there's even a consideration that the reagent supply is in jeopardy. So that's not sustainable. But that's where we are right now, because that's the gold standard. But I think the big hope is for the point of care testing. And we talked about this before, and there are different types. There's like a point of care antigen test. So that's a different strategy. It looks at a protein on the inside of the virus, rather than looking at an amplification of the nucleic acid profile of the virus. But there are other ways of doing point of care that are emerging. There's a point of care PCR test, or there's also a point of care isothermal test. So these are all, again, working with the virus. And what's important is the number of virus particles that are necessary for detection. So that's one debate. But the other debate that's not really clear is, well, how many virus particles that are there for detection, how many are necessary to actually really lead to a contagion or infection? So all of that's being worked out. We are getting data from the professional sports teams because they're using the gold standard, but they also have point of care tests. And so they're comparing, what the results are. And so we're really hopeful that we'll have those answers sometime in the next couple of months. Because when you're thinking about testing on a very regular basis, or we think about our championships, it really becomes tactically really challenging to always be sending something out to a lab from different parts of the country. So that's sort of a brief synopsis of where we are today.
So Juliette, the NCAA is made up of private and public institutions. Every state is different, as you have well documented. How could this work in a world where every state may have different guidelines, may have different access, money to testing capabilities, especially a public school versus a private institution?
Right. So, and it is that, look, I often say, I teach in crisis management, a crisis hits a nation or a state or an institution as it is not how you want it to be. So rich schools will still be rich, poor schools will still not have access to money. And you're seeing that exacerbated by the sort of lack of a federal overlay, which is driving priorities. Well, in terms of supply chain, the Defense Production Act, the production of testing kits and other materials that are needed for it, as well as, come on, the potential for a second wave. We're in wave one, right? So the combination of the regular flu season with COVID. So you're not going to get a unified approach. And what that means is what you're at least seeing in terms of foreign countries is that we're only as healthy as our weakest link. This is why I think people in New England, for example, are like, was I just inside for 4 months for nothing? You're sort of upset, because you're seeing what's happening in the rest of the country. Just the nature of a vaccine, nature of a virus is it's borderless. And so we have to take our weakest institutions and assume that that's going to be the standard, because a stronger institution or a stronger state is not likely to want to play literally and figuratively with a sicker state or institution, because then you're just out, right? Then you're just, if your people get sick, you're gonna, then you're just out. So that's why you're starting to see travel restrictions, times for quarantine for out-of-staters. For example, Vermont, which does not have a masking order right now, is likely to go to one, not because anything significant is happening there, but they see all these Southerners and New Yorkers coming their way. So that's basically the whack-a-mole. It's a whack-a-mole approach, a hodgepodge responses that you'll see. And that's why it's a challenge for, I think, institutions or entities that cover a lot of different institutions like the NCAA, because, do you want to be aspirational or do you have to be realistic? It's hard.
So Brian, as part of the resocialization, one of the criteria out there was a 72-hour window of testing before competition. That was put out last week. We're seeing in the NBA, I mean, they're paying for it. They're in their bubble, but they're testing literally every day. And so far as we're taping, you know, they haven't had any positive tests, but they're in that bubble. How realistic, a week into throwing that out there, is a 72-hour window in advance of competition? And I know competition hasn't happened and may not happen until September, but how realistic is that?
Well, today would be challenging, Andy, and one of the things that we put in the document, one of the reasons for discontinuing sport or athletics is that you can't follow through with testing. And so, you know, we had talked about different scenarios. So should it be 24 hours, 48, 72, 1 week? And, you know, you could argue that 24 hours is better, but 24 hours also might not be enough. I mean, a lot can happen in 24 hours, and the test is only as good as the moment it's taken. So ultimately, that's where we landed. But again, that's why I think there's going to have to be a strategic shift. And the document clearly has an opening for that, that as technologies evolve, that we will be making that strategic shift.
All right, Julie, I want to shift to something that we all have hope for vaccine.
Gotta have hope.
A couple of coaches that just read the headlines and will say to me, hey, we may have a vaccine by the fall. Hey, we can take the problem. But I always remember this quote that you've said, which is, a vaccine doesn't cure it, a vaccination does.
Right, a vaccine never saved a life.
You have to actually get it in your arm, not just know that it's out there.
Exactly, the last mile, as they say. So this is like the logistics nightmare that we're anticipating. So first of all, we don't have a vaccine yet. So all the good news people are hearing, all the money floating around, that's fantastic. The Chinese have something, the Europeans have something. We have something, tests are going forward, lots of companies, you know, got through hurdle 1, fewer through hurdle 2, but there's progress, and the smartest people in the world are focused on this. But let's just assume that there's one that's going to work for vast majority of us. You got to identify it, manufacture it, and then you got to do the hardest thing that's ever going to happen in some ways in this country, or lots of hard things happen, but probably the greatest logistical challenge ever, which will be a fair, fast, transparent vaccine distribution system through 50 states, territories, tribals that cannot happen at the same time. It's going to be a rolling vaccination. So who goes first? That one's easy. Military, law enforcement, public safety, public health. That we always get. Who goes second, third, fourth, and last? And the ethical challenge. So first, so here's how someone like me thinks about it, because I do worry exactly. When you told me you were hearing that from coaches, I was like, oh my God, like this is a problem with calling something Operation Warp Speed, right? Which is, you know, people think, well, we found it, therefore it's in my arm. You got to add a lot of time. And I think it also gives a false sense that this period, which is a really funky period where we're trying to figure out how to live with the virus, you know, this sort of pseudo recovery that we, you know, or this new normal, as some people say, is going to be short-lived. It's not short-lived. I have personally written off 2020, and I actually am now you know, in the sense Christmas is not going to be the same, Thanksgiving is not the same. And I don't think the first part of 2021, I think it's going to be a lot more treatments, a lot more information, a lot more testing. So we'll live better than we live now. But for a vaccine, you know, we got a while. It's a big distribution program. So I say, pray for a, what is it? You know, pray for a vaccine, plan for otherwise until further notice, which is essentially then wear a mask and be smart.
So Brian, to that point, because I don't know if you've heard, but that's what I've been hearing. You know, how have you had to answer that question from members of the NCAA about the time it will take, even if we get a vaccine that's approved sometime in 2020 or the beginning of 21?
Yeah, well, I'm usually pretty blunt and say, look, in the history of vaccine development in this world, we've never seen anything come that fast. Maybe that could change, but let's be realistic. And essentially, I'm saying the same things Juliette's saying. Let's really plan well into 2021 and make certain that we're doing things properly. And when the vaccine's rolled out and it's there, we find it's effective and safe, well, that's fine. But expecting that, you know, by the end of this year or even the beginning of 2021, it just doesn't seem realistic.
Yeah.
All right. So to that point, this is where I want to wrap up in terms of being a little more optimistic.
Okay, good.
Of how we live with it. Because no decision has been made about what's going to happen in the fall and the beginning of winter. So with that being said, let's put the vaccine away, not even think about it right now. How do we get back to having sports in the near term, a couple of months from now, worst case scenario, later into 20 or into 21? Brian, I'll start with you, and Juliette, what's the best way to make this happen in some form or fashion?
Well, Andy, I would like to take a giant step back and look at sport and society and get back to something Juliette was talking about earlier, about being fair and equitable. And so if we really wanted to do this right, we would make certain that at the youth sport level, at the high school level, that we could actually risk mitigate and test. And there would be equal access to testing for those who want to be engaged in sport, for those who want to go back to school. And we don't have that national strategy. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, we're going to have to figure it out. And everyone is going to have to understand that essentially the person that you're with is potentially infectious, and you have to live accordingly. And so that is the new normal, and that's the new normal for quite some time. But I think the caveat is that when we really do have point of care testing, we're going to be able to make decisions much more rationally and even do mathematical modeling much more quickly and understand where this virus is moving. So there is some hope, I think, because the testing paradigm will shift and the cost will go down.
Yeah. I think that's right. From our different perches, we're at the same place, I think, which is there's an end, and that's until further notice. I literally just I stop myself from reading about vaccine because I know half of it I think is just for stock prices. So this period in crisis management, this is not a typical recovery period. So in most crises, you have the bad thing happens, a hurricane, the tornado, the terrorist incident, or a pandemic. You have an immediate response. You save people, you put out the fire, you do all the things you do to save lives. And then you move immediately to recovery. And because the bad thing is gone, the terrorists are dead, the hurricane has gone through, the tornado is down the street. So this is completely different, which is we're going into recovery, or eventually we'll go into recovery. Some places are still in response with the enemy still around. And so we call it adaptive recovery because it is going to be different every day. And that's where the pivoting, the lessons learned, the speed all matter. Because if we can keep as many things open as possible, that into the future, that's good for the students, the student athletes, and the economy. And so I want to end on a hopeful note. If I sound like the time frame is very long for a vaccine and today seems kind of crappy because of everything going on, lots of good stuff will happen between today and then, right? We're getting smarter about the virus. The virus, we know how to stop it, right? I mean, look at Europe, look at China. We are getting better treatments, which I'm much more gung-ho about. People are getting smarter. I mean, you look at the polling, 80% of Americans want mandatory masking. So it won't be normal like 2019. We won't feel that way, but it will get more familiar. Like it will begin to feel like, okay, this is how we manage around a virus until it dies on its own or we get a vaccine. And that should be hopeful.
And on a hopeful note, that's all we can ask, Juliette.
Exactly.
Juliette Kayyem, Dr.
You.
Brian Hainline, appreciate it. As always, you can go to ncaa.org/social series, where we've archived all 18 of these episodes. We're going to continue this throughout the course of the year. Every week to come, we've got more to discuss on this as we get closer and closer to students getting on campus. We'll have to see how it all goes. Appreciate all your time. This information is always incredibly educational. Stay safe, everyone.